Okay, welcome everyone to our 8th Scalable Pandas meetup. I'm so excited to be here with you today. And I'm especially excited that we have Cody here to speak with us about Pandas dbt and Pandas. We'll put, in honor of the guest, we'll refer to dbt first before Pandas. Our agenda, we'll just really briefly recap meeting goals, do some quick intros, and then we'll move on to the main event, which is dbt and Pandas. So what are these meetups about? So these meetups are about discussing challenges that come from using pandas at scale. And these can be using pandas with really large data sets or really complex workflows, and then talking about solutions to those challenges. So best practices, case studies, examples. Who is Ponder? Ponder is the enterprise-ready pandas company where I work. I'm the chief of staff. And we're the creator of primary maintainer of Modin, which is a scalable drop-in replacement for pandas. Has over 5 million downloads. We just recently launched our first product, which is pandas on a data warehouse, so Snowflake, et cetera. So you can scale with the data warehouse as your backend. We're super excited about that. You can learn more on our website, ponder.io. Why did Ponder start these meetups? We started these meetups to create content and build a community around dealing with Panda scale challenges, working with pandas at scale. How often will these be held? These are held every fourth Thursday. So our next one, I believe, is February 23rd, typically at the same time, 10 a.m. Pacific. And then how could I get involved? If you'd like to present at one of these, if you have an idea for topics, you can email me at peter@ponder.io. So I get to introduce Cody Peterson, which makes me very happy. Cody is a product manager for dbt Core. He spent 4 years at Microsoft as a PM with Azure ML before that. And I know from chatting with Cody and that he has a lot of experience looking into different scalable data frame more generally, but specifically sort of scalable pandas tools. So he's a great person to talk to because he's done some deep dives on that topic. So he can tell you all about, there's a lot of different tools out there. He can weigh in on the pros and cons, and hopefully we'll hear some of that today. And then Cody has a degree in electrical engineering from Rice. So Cody, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to you, and then we'll have time for audience Q&A after Cody presents. If you have a burning question, feel free to enter in the chat, and we can answer some of them partway through as well.
So yeah, hopefully we'll touch on a lot of cool points in this presentation. Want to spend the back half mostly showing dbt and doing a demo, but we'll start by kind of motivating my journey to both learning about dbt and scalable pandas in general. We're a very opinionated product, opinionated company, so you will see some opinions throughout this presentation. We would call this kind of contributing to the knowledge loop. I'm going to basically motivate why I am where I am within my thinking of dbt and pandas through my background. Then I'll talk about the scalability of some of these tools and some of my observations. Kind of while preparing for this, I realized all of my knowledge is actually like 2 years out of date or so. So we'll touch on that a little bit, but hopefully that's insightful. And then showing off dbt, pandas, and some of these tools. So let's jump in. This is an article that I read about a year ago, came out a little under a year ago, called MLOps is a Mess, but That's to Be Expected. And I bring it up because it was around this time that I actually first learned myself what dbt was. I had this kind of data science Python background, and I was working in the MLOps space, and it was around this time I heard about dbt, and I read this article, which puts very well what MLOps is kind of interdisciplinary process between software engineering, I would argue data engineering in here, data science, DevOps, and it was the first time that I really saw dbt actually come up organically in stuff that I was already reading. So they had this chart in there that has dbt under this exploration, actually right next to pandas and rapids, which is not actually correct placement of the tool, but still cool for the first time to see it as I was interviewing with dbt labs, seeing it next to tools I was already familiar with. And I'm going to reference that MLOps or just pull screenshots from it quite a bit. But one of the big learnings about MLOps is that these tools on their own are not particularly useful. They have to drive some sort of organizational value. They have to accomplish something generally in production, some sort of ML system that is doing something for an organization. And the first time I kind of got into that as a product manager was this feature called Data Drift for Azure Machine Learning. And so you're seeing a GIF of it here that I just ripped from the documentation. I took the screenshot yesterday. This was launched in summer of 2019 and is still in preview today. And basically what's going on here is it is running some computations on your data. It's trying to provide a nice GUI so that you can see what's going on and tell that my data has drifted. So I need to train a machine learning model. You can see it's kind of breaking it down by each feature that you have, does some fancy stuff. And the whole point of this was that we were trying to provide organizational value to people doing ML ops so that they could know when their data has changed and retrain a machine learning model. One of the biggest issues that this experienced, and why I would argue it's kind of still in preview and didn't really see, it saw some adoption, but not a ton, is really this kind of curve, again, from the ML ops article. So there are actually very few companies that are far along on this ML maturity model that are really doing this type of like, we need to retrain when data hits some certain metric, and all of these other things that you see aspirationally from a lot of the smaller companies or companies that are labeled here as doing ML at reasonable scale. So one of the weird issues as a product manager is, of course, if you go and ask a customer or user, hey, do you want this cool thing? They're going to say yes. But if you go a little deeper and say, are you actually going to use this data drift thing in production? You can kind of get deeper and get a better sense of how they're going to use the tool. So that was one of the problems with this, kind of the first thing I ever worked with as a product manager. The second one is a little more subtle, and it's these like customizable open standards. So we're showing like Wasserstein distance, we're showing Euclidean distance, we're running some metrics, but then a customer comes and says, hey, actually, I need this custom metric. Can you plug that into this dashboard? And the answer is no, not really. This is built on top of a Python SDK behind our service. A few years later, actually, we would open source what is kind of running behind the scenes here. We just did that in my GitHub account here. I called it the ML Drift package. And I pulled this in to kind of show you what was actually going on behind the scenes. So I pulled out, I coded it so that it would work with ML Flow and kind of work with these newer tools. But otherwise, this code is completely unchanged from what the devs wrote in 2019. So you're importing LightGBM, NumPy, Pandas, sklearn, and SciPy. And if we had built this in the open to start with and made it pluggable, maybe things would have gone differently. But one of the other issues that we did see for those customers who were far enough along that maturity model was that they actually had fairly large data, and this would not scale for them. So we're just using, again, raw NumPy, Pandas, not really dealing with any scaling challenges. So that's what initially motivated me to start looking into like scalability for our customers in Azure ML. And I kind of went, I think, pretty deep into this space. So again, if we bring this back up, while a lot of customers are not as sophisticated on the ML maturity model, they might be on the data. And if they're sophisticated on ML, they probably have big data. So the types of users that want to do that data drifting probably need your code to scale. So that was what kicked this all off. And at the time, I was looking at a landscape, something like this, all of these choices out in front of me as a user, choices for our users. There's Pandas, Dask, Modin, Rapids, Vex, Apache Spark. And it presents kind of a hard choice as a user. Like, how do I actually look at this and make a decision? What is my decision-making plane? What criteria do I have? And a lot of this is just going to be personal preference. Some of it's going to be organizational needs. But what I was trying to get across with this slide is like, it's actually hard to know how someone is going to make that decision. And there's not going to be a single right decision for everyone. So back in 2019, I looked at this space, and these are just kind of the things that have what I would call dataframe APIs. And I got confused on the slide order. But if you look at these and you dig into any single one of them, there's actually a ton more to learn about them. So Dask dataframes and Spark dataframes, just taking an example, might have different syntax for group bys. They might return different types when you call head. That was actually an issue that we saw yesterday with Spark. If you just go into Spark, there are different types of data frames. There's koalas before a certain version of Spark. There's pandas on Spark after that. Can you run GPUs on them? There are all these kind of questions that as you dig into them. And so it's very overwhelming to look at this and actually make an informed decision as a user. If we also throw in some extra tools that are in this area, like dplyr from R and IBIS and Ray, which is more of a backend system, then this choice becomes pretty hard. So I looked at this in sometime late 2019. Fortunately, a few of these didn't exist, so I didn't have to consider them. And then I kind of continued to dig in. I looked at like, Vex and Snowflake, or Vex in particular, and just frankly didn't like it as a user. And same thing with R. I always had issues getting Ray set up, so that kind of threw out Ray. Kind of similarly tossed out modin, and then Spark was very important for work, but I also didn't like it. So this was kind of the stack that I really dove into, and I want to just kind of jump over and show you where this ended up. So I tried to put the GIFs in here and it didn't go well, so we'll just head over to GitHub. And this is kind of where I ended up. So this is a dask cluster running in Azure ML on probably 100 nodes. And basically what you see is this large task graph that's going through and just running a .describe. I really like the describe function because it's doing a lot of things. It's like grouping, it's doing all of these heavy computations. And you can see that we're working with like 750 gigabytes in memory here. If I just head through a few of these other GIFs, this is how it was actually spinning up. So you can see we're spinning up to 100 nodes. I think it'll be like 4 terabytes in the end when this actually finishes. You can see if we try to write all that data out, we're dealing with actually over a terabyte of data, which is cool. So all this was really cool. Looks like I finally committed this in January 2020. And this was, I thought, really cool. I was able to, as a user, actually set all this up, get data running on hundreds of gigabytes, and get everything working. But it took a lot of effort back then. And if you go back even further in time, it's going to take more and more effort. So today, users are presented with all of these options and really even more. If we kind of zoom out back into that MLOps article, this is another picture that they put up. Not all of these are data tools, not all of these are even relevant, but the point is like, there's all of this user choice in front of us and it's hard to make a decision. So I want to just run through some of the things I learned very quickly and then get into the demo and actually talking about dbt. So anything you're doing has to actually create value for people. All of those tools that we saw are like mildly at least successful because they do that. People have different opinions and prefer different ones, but they're all accomplishing some real task. There's definitely this question of, is there one API to rule them all? And that's kind of, I think, the pandas and modin and koalas and pandas on Spark and a lot of these things are really showing that value for users in some sense is to learn a single interface and be able to scale it in the back end. Don't do distributed computing. This is a pretty well-known one that anyone who works with this will tell you is scale vertically before you scale horizontally. Once you start getting into distributed computing, things are very hard. Understanding the technology bottlenecks is similar. When you actually dig in with a lot of these users and customers, most of them actually don't need the types of scale that we're seeing, and oftentimes pandas is just sufficient. The ecosystem, as I have hopefully shown, is quite fragmented right now, and I think that's a real problem for users. But fortunately, there are a bunch of great communities like this one that seem to be popping up and working to solve these problems. And that's very awesome to see. I would call out too that these communities are themselves somewhat fragmented across Slack, GitHub, Discourse, whatever. These are just some of the Slack channels that I'm in and try to keep some watch on. Okay, all that time as a dbt product manager, and I haven't mentioned dbt. Where does dbt come into this? We saw it with pandas and rapids earlier, and that's not how I would argue that it fits in. We often hear this term that dbt is the T, the transform in ETL, extract, transform, load. I put this Perl quote that I hear often internally, which is make easy things easy and hard things possible. There's no Perl in dbt, but the motto is very much in the same stream as what dbt is trying to accomplish. And I would kind of personally put this as call this DevOps for data analysts. So the idea is that dbt makes it very easy for you to, whatever framework you're using, whatever backend you're using, organize your code, run it in production, and do things in a software engineering best practice style so that you can work efficiently. This is an article that our CEO wrote in 2017, well before I joined the company. Why doesn't dbt support Python? And basically the answer is that SQL alone can accomplish most non-data science workloads. That has shifted in the 5 years since into why it's time for dbt support to support Python from the same CEO. So we launched our actual Python support a couple months after this, officially in October of 2022. And you can kind of go back and read the shift. But to summarize it, it's that Python opens more doors for more people, transforming more data in dbt. For the rest of these slides, I'm basically just pulling from our Coalesce conference presentation. And so we see a lot of similarities with Python and SQL. We see a lot of the same problems being solved. So in some sense, like this Python and data science ecosystem has existed in a little bit of a silo from the SQL and analytics engineering ecosystem, but they're all solving the same problems. And dbt is now trying to at least get into the Python and data science side of things. Where Python really shines is probably the things, if you're here, you already know that Pandas is good at, but these slides, of course, were for a SQL audience. So it's data munging, it's having these packages, which are new to SQL people or can be different, and advanced statistical techniques. As far as the why now specifically, it's really that the backend data platforms that dbt abstracts away from you are supporting both. So they're moving towards this like polyglot platforms where they support both SQL and Python mixed together quite well in a single data platform. Snowflake invested heavily in that with Snowpark. Databricks in the other direction has been investing in their Photon and SQL things. This is kind of an overview of dbt again. It sits on top of your data platform. It allows you to develop your data set, your clean data sets, test everything, and ideally have a clean workflow. So we believe that SQL and Python are better together. Enables more packages, more developers, and it's supercharged by the dbt community. So these strong communities that know how to do work effectively and get their jobs done. So that was a lot of talking. Let's actually head over to VS Code and show how you can run dbt with duckdb, pandas, modin, dask, polars, really whatever you want. You see my VS Code? Good, yeah. Okay, so we have VS Code open here. And let's actually very quickly kind of go through what dbt does. So just to test this, I started off kind of thinking back to how did I do this back in the day? And the first thing I really did was I got a big data set and I tried to read it into pandas and crashed my memory. And I remember it being a lot easier than it was this time to do. So you can see that I generated an 18 gigabyte CSV file and about an 8 gigabyte Parquet file, import pandas, read it in, and I really expected this to fail, and it did not. So that was impressive. I can actually print out the data frame. I can actually read in the Parquet one as well. I can actually go ahead and describe them. It takes a while, but it works. And so that was, again, one of the interesting learnings for me was doing this in the past couple of weeks was actually things work better, much better than I expected. I was able to finally crash my kernel by just concatenating those two data frames and trying to describe them. So mission accomplished there at least. But I want to dig into then what you can kind of do with dbt in here and show first off our first dbt model. So this is a dbt model. It's called billion.sql. And the purpose of this model is just to generate a billion rows of data. You'll notice that this actually mostly is not SQL. This is Jinja SQL. And what this does, what dbt does when you run a dbt, if we change in there, if we run a dbt compile, That's actually going to read that and then write out to this compiled model here. Let me figure that out. So this is the actual SQL that gets generated. If I put these side by side, this is the actual SQL that gets generated on the right from the code on the left by dbt. And this is like profound for SQL first people because you have for loops and you have control flows and you can do all of these things that are much harder to do in SQL alone. And then once you do this, you can go ahead and do a dbt run. And the way I have this set up, it will actually run these 4 models. So I'm running dask, I'm running modin, I'm running pandas, and I'm running polars. So those are in these bench. We'll just open those up quickly, close some stuff, and we'll see those run. I think the dask one will take about 20 seconds. Modin will take around the same time, and we'll let those run. But basically what's going on here is these are dbt Python models. I am basically just running Python locally in a duckdb process through dbt. So I did a dbt run command. It's going and finding these 4 models. It's running them all and then printing out the times. You might ask why that's useful. And frankly, it's not that useful. And so I want to motivate this with a more realistic use case. And that is this other Jaffle Shops demo. And this is a more realistic look at what a dbt project would look like. So if you go into the models here, you'll see like these staging models, and these are a bunch of SQL models. You'll see YAML files that kind of document them. You'll see metrics defined on top of these models. And then you'll see where I started doing data prep work in Python and machine learning work, which I didn't actually finish. But part of the point here is that I can build on top of what my team already did in SQL in Python. So the main thing I want to show here is number one, that we can dbt run this. And so that's going to go and create a bunch of different SQL models and then eventually get to the Python models and run them all. Kind of in this sequential DAG, and that finishes. And that's cool. But that's not really what dbt is about. dbt is also about being able to document all this, being able to test all of this. So if I run dbt test, it's actually going to run the tests that I've defined on all of this data, ensuring that there are no nulls, and running any custom tests that I define on top of them. If we look at this outliers one, this is basically just looking at my feature set that I wanted to use for ML and making sure that there are no outliers. And this test would fail if there were. So that allows you to test your data as you're developing it. And then finally, there's these dbt docs. That's a bash alias and not a real dbt command, but we'll open that up. And this is kind of the main interface that a lot of people would interact with. These are the dbt docs. And this shows that a little nicer than looking at code, how this project is laid out. So I have this outliers test that we just saw that is testing features. My features are built on top of this combined SQL model that's combining a bunch of upstream models into a feature set that I could go and do machine learning on top of. I did not finish that demo, but we do have some example code from Coalesce on how we have done machine learning in here. And I hope this has been okay to follow, but that is my quick overview of scaling pandas, scaling dbt, and everything in there. And I will say, like, the comment I would give on what we've seen with dbt so far is we've seen like decent adoption of Python, and we've definitely seen like it's very common to get issues where if we actually just dive into one of these models in here. Sure. So you can see that I'm calling Pandas API on this model. And so this is actually in Databricks. So this is a Spark on a Pandas on Spark data frame. It's hard to keep all of it straight. And the biggest issue that we actually see is that people are expecting this to be a Pandas data frame and will often raise the issues when it is not. So I don't have hard numbers, but definitely seeing a lot of Pandas in dbt, starting to see hopefully the combination of these communities, and I'm very excited for what the future holds. That's all I got.
Cody, thank you so much. Okay, I have so many questions. I'm really excited about this. And everyone, so I'm going to ask a couple questions, and then feel free to add questions in the chat, and I'll have people come off mute. But first, selfishly, I'm going to ask a couple questions. Okay, so that demo you just ran, where was the data living in that demo? Is this on your local machine and you're using, or were you pulling it from a data warehouse somewhere?
Yeah, this is all local. Basically what's going on here, we'll zoom out a little. Basically, I'm just running in duckdb, and in Jaffle shops, I'm running this. I actually tried to do this myself, kind of a long story. But basically I'm running this tool that a colleague made that generates these CSV files. And then we're calling, there's a dbt seed command, and that allows you to put CSV or local files into your data warehouse, basically. So I'm using duckdb as a local data warehouse, even though that's not how normally you would use dbt. Normally you would connect up to your remote data warehouse. Yeah.
Okay, so Cody, as someone who is not a dbt pro, I was, for context, I was a data scientist before, so I code in Pandas a lot, but a lot of the scalability stuff I ran into, like other teams took care of it. They built tools, the kernel would crash or whatever, but like that sort of, I didn't spend a ton of time thinking about what tool should I be adopting, because it was a big company and it didn't feel like I even necessarily had the flexibility. So anyway, so most of what I know about dbt, for example, just comes from reading the documentation, talking to people, watching videos. So I just want to share for the audience something, and then you can tell me if it's right or wrong. So this is my current understanding of how this world fits together. So you have, a fundamental confusion for me is I hear the word database a ton, and then I hear data warehouse. It took me a while to learn that a data warehouse is a specialized form of a database that's used for analytical workflows, for like analysts sitting there trying to give reporting numbers, or maybe someone asks a question and they want to figure out how many customers we have and blank. So there are tons of databases out there that are more transactional. They're like really good at, someone signs up at your website, they buy a product, it updates. It's like really fast at handling all sorts of issues with concurrency, like people doing things at the same time. Data warehouses are really good for analytical workflows. So that was the first, and Snowflake and BigQuery and and Redshift and stuff. This is in the data warehouse realm. Okay, so dbt. It took me a while. Like I was reading online about ELT versus ETL, and it seems to me that dbt is part of this new era where it's like, hey, actually, it used to be the case that the stuff you loaded into your data warehouse was pretty cleaned already. But now we're saying like, actually, no, you can put very raw data in. And then dbt sits on top of, it does the transformation part, and it sits on top of the data warehouse. So now you extract your data from wherever it is, you load it into your data warehouse, and then dbt sits there and it does a lot of things to produce much better, like cleaner data. It helps you manage your pipelines. It helps you document your pipelines. I think for me in my previous company, this would have been super helpful because we had tons of SQL pipelines. Errors would pop up. You'd trace them back. It just was like, and it was so messy. I should be careful, I guess, what I say, because people can go look and figure out. Anyway, but this is true of every company. I don't think like, no, every company is this way. And so I can see the value in dbt and helping document, add tests, but it's sitting on top of the data warehouse. Okay, so what you just ran was local in most use cases, which is, I think, awesome. And in most use cases, they're going to interact with, you're going to interact with Snowflake or Databricks or BigQuery, I think, are the three right now. And you have, within Snowflake, you have like Snowpark, which is, you can do things. There's dataframe commands that are kind of like pandas, but actually under the hood, it's converting them into SQL. And so it really plays well in the whole Snowflake ecosystem. And the same thing is true for Databricks. You have like PySpark and Spark stuff, and it looks like Pandas kind of, the dataframes, but not the same API. And what it'll do, and then there are various flavors. But it'll convert it into like basically the code it works with anyway. I think so as I look at all this stuff, one of the things I'm very confused about is the world of like, when dbt is interacting with pandas sitting on top of Snowflake, say, and when it uses Snowpark, that makes sense. It's really just still in SQL land. Actually, it's getting converted, is my understanding. But when you work with, I know that there's like pandas support, pandas data frame support across these three, and I don't know what that means if it's not using Snowpark. Like Snowflake, does it have machines internally that it spins up that like can support just random pandas code that like are, I don't know. So that was a lot of talking. I hope it's helpful for other people as I kind of struggle through to understand all these moving parts. You could tell me if anything that I said is incorrect, but also just like, how does aside from Snowpark and PySpark, what would it mean for to use dbt with pandas on these backends?
Yeah, so all of these backends, it sounds like you're actually going through a very similar learning journey that I did when I joined dbt. I like barely knew what Snowflake did, was very not into this whole database data warehouse. Now we're kind of calling them data platform world. But I think the way you put it has been correct. There's transactional databases versus analytical databases. Those are often like row-based versus column-based. And yeah, there's a lot of weeds in there to get into. The way that dbt supports pandas, actually taking a step back. So a very good confusion that we see a lot that you kind of brought up is, what is dbt actually doing here? So dbt is compiling your code into the target directory that I showed. And then the code in here actually gets sent off to whatever your backend platform is and executed there. So the way that you would work in dbt, if I actually just wanted to switch out this project, and instead of running it on duckdb, running it on Snowflake, I would just change this line. And assuming I had my Snowflake profile set up, it should just work as long as all of the same code worked in Snowpark. And then what's happening in that case is I'm compiling my code, I'm shipping it off to Snowflake or to whatever backend. When that's duckdb locally, it's just my local Python process. But when it's Snowpark, it's Snowpark's Python process, and then it's running there. And then to your question of like, so Snowpark data frames compile down into SQL, but the Python code that you run in Snowpark is running in a regular Python environment. And so in this code here, you can see that all of these basically support some form of a toPandas method. In Snowflake, it's lowercase snake case. In Spark, it's like something else. In duckdb, it's .df. But all of them have some way of converting to pandas. And then you basically are just running Python code that has converted to pandas within your dbt model. And if I didn't add these lines, these would be Snowpark data frames that compile down to SQL. And
if you do toPandas, does the data then come out into memory on your own machine?
Yeah, they use Era.
Oh, okay. So, okay. And it seems like Mariah, if you want to come off and say something more about, do you have anything to add to this understanding? I should say also, I feel a little sheepish revealing like how I'm sorting through all this, because people at my company, there's a bunch of PhDs who are the database experts. So like if someone on the call, they're like, oh, Peter, you just said something that was subtly not true for the world. And so I apologize to my colleagues, but I hope that sort of my sorting through all of this is actually helpful for some people too, who are trying to figure out what's going on. Yeah, Mariah, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Hi, no, I don't. I was just responding to, I think, something that you had said before Cody responded, but I think, yeah, Cody's understanding is probably better than mine, so I'll defer.
Yeah, it sounded like your comment was what Cody was saying about how, it seems like the two are quite in agreement. Okay, so I have a ton more questions, but I also want to open it up for the audience. And the sun has just come out right on me. It makes me, I have a friend in college who he got, for mental health reasons, a really bright light in his room. It was on the wall. And people would comment that like, if you walk by his dorm room and looked up, it looked like he was holding an angel captive or something. It was so bright outside out through the window. Are there does anyone want to ask, come off mute and ask a question that's burning for them? If not, I have plenty more questions. Yeah.
On the poller's timing, I think it was about 4 seconds. Yeah, so it is faster. This is not a super representative benchmark or anything, but yeah, the timings are there.
Okay, so some of the other things that I'm curious about, how do you see this moving forward in the future? Because it feels like dbt, I think some of the subtext of what you were saying in your presentation is, hey, like really advanced MLOps features, turns out a lot of people don't need those yet. There's a lot of things that we can kind of do for them in the dbt ecosystem that like start to edge to push over into data science workflows. It's very clear to me that Pandas stuff like transformations, sort of data prep things, that's very natural to have that move into dbt's world. I'm curious about like machine learning stuff more generally. How do you think dbt is kind of colliding against MLOps companies, or do you, yeah. And if you feel restricted by your current employment from, I don't know, like to like making a, sometimes, you know, making a prediction like that is tricky, but what's your take on if dbt originally was bridging engineering and analytics, and now dbt is moving into a phase where it's bridging analytics and data science? How's that going to look over the next few years?
I think it's a natural thing to happen. To be clear, like we're not positioning dbt as an MLOps tool, or really even for, certainly not for machine learning, though. Like I think more generally, we're seeing a lot of discussion around personas, and is data science actually different than analytics engineer and data engineering? So I think it's a more general convergence. I am excited to see more talk about dbt in the MLOps space. There are actually people doing that ML at reasonable scale, and dbt is a component of what they are doing. There's some cool examples of that. To some extent, like we are a SQL first, our DNA is SQL. We are a SQL first company. And so a lot of it's just like cross community education. So I think this is really cool to do. And to start to have these like, again, I think like both you and I, it sounds like we've experienced this where we've been more in the Python data science world and learn these things. And then it's like, what are databases? What are warehouses? Why are some better at other things? There are all these questions. I think dbt sits in the middle of those and can offer a very interesting, very useful experience for like building and running these DAGs and kind of documenting your code. That's actually something I should have shown here. You know, all of your models here are actually documented, so you can go and see my customers and what it depends on, and like all of these are just engineering problems. Yeah, I see dbt playing in this space. I can't make any predictions on like how it'll go exactly. I think on our side, we just launched Python 4 months ago or so. And we're kind of seeing the start of adoption, seeing the start of these conversations. We're putting together workshops ourselves. So it's very early days. And I'm just excited to see where it goes.
Just a couple, thank you so much for that. A couple more minutes here. Like Matt Harrison asked about guidelines about when to use SQL versus Python. You touched on this a little bit, but do you have any more thoughts?
Yeah, that's where dbt is very biased. So if you ask most people in dbt, they're going to tell you to use SQL most of the time for just about anything, unless you need to pick up Python. Personally, like I would write myself a full dbt project with Python if I were working alone. That's probably what I would do. But kind of what you touched on is like, in reality, most of us are working in organizations where things are set up and we're building on top of each other. So I really like this idea that like I can just focus on the parts that I know, like the data science pieces, and build on top of the SQL that other people have done. So my general guidance would be like, use SQL if it's something simple and needs to be efficient, like doing joins. In fact, actually, when I wrote this big join in here for this somewhere, I actually did it in SQL myself. I was like, I'm not really a SQL person, but it's faster. I know how to do it. It'll work. Yeah, the dbt recommendation is pretty much SQL for everything, and then Python for those last bits. My personal recommendation is use whatever makes the most sense for you and your organization. It'll depend a lot. We try to be opinionated about like the workflows, and that like you should be testing your data and that you should be documenting it and things like that, and less so on the nitty-gritty of how you are doing your work.
Yeah, that makes sense. For one other comment I wanted to make, and we'll do one more question then close, is you talked about Jinja as you were going through your examples. It took me just a little while to understand what was going on there. Like dbt, what you're doing is, and you showed this in the demo, but just to call this out, like a templating language like Jinja, what that meant was it's creating the SQL query that you'll then run, but it's creating it really flexibly. So in some cases, if you weren't using this, you'd have to say like, select this table and this table and take the mean and select this table, this column and take the mean and this column and take the mean and this column and take the mean and da 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 da. And so Jinja allows you to sort of produce the SQL, the resulting SQL query in a really cool way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh yes, you go first, and I'll look at this next question.
sure. Yeah, it turns like 11 lines of code into 20 lines of code. Yeah, so like what you pointed out there is there's like the source that you actually write. dbt compiles that into this, and then exactly this is what gets sent over to the warehouse for both SQL and Python. Python models are a little different.
So maybe this will be our final question, unless something else is a burning one. So Bahadur, do you want to come off mute?
Hey, Cody, thank you. It was really exciting. Thank you for showing us how dbt works. So one question that I have is that it seems that dbt, and again, I'm a newbie. I don't know much about dbt, but it seems that dbt combines modular SQL with software engineering best practices. And based on your experience talking to the customers and users, I'm wondering how well data science teams with little software engineering background adopt this. Is like these days, many customers that I personally talk to, they come from like, different backgrounds, and they don't really have that software engineering background. So they're not familiar with the best practices of software engineering. So yeah, how do they adopt this?
Yeah, a lot of our customers, especially historically, have really just had messes of SQL queries and using stored procedures and a bunch of less optimal things. So the first thing you see a lot of times adopting dbt is actually you have to teach Git or at least some subset of Git to your data analysts. Today, like we see data engineers actually use dbt quite a lot. People who call themselves analysts or analytics engineers use a lot. And I actually just the other day saw in our internal Slack this team of data scientists that was using dbt, and I started asking like, hey, what are they doing? What machine learning? And the context said like, oh, they're not actually data scientists. They're like analytics people who call themselves. And so like there's kind of these personas and terminology, but the general trend is that, yeah, you kind of have to teach engineering background things to people who very often do not have engineering backgrounds, or even if they do, like I didn't learn Git in college. I didn't learn how memory works really on a fundamental level, like all of these things that are pretty key to doing your work in an organization. So yeah, there's a lot of like different personas and a lot of different use cases for dbt. But that's a general theme, moving you along this like software engineering maturity curve.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We have one last question from Mariah. Yeah, Mariah, do you want to come off just so people can hear voices and see faces? Do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Sure. So yeah, my question is not for Cody, but it's for the Ponder folks, because I am an extensive dbt user. And I guess my question is just like, now that Ponder has released that new product that allows you to run pandas in cloud data warehouses or on databases, why would I want to use that if I can write Python dbt models that already do that? Or
yeah,
like when it be appropriate to opt for that versus the dbt?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so we have a very particular philosophy. Most of what dbt does, we don't have too much to say about it. So I can easily imagine a world in which you'd use dbt and Ponder. Our philosophy is we want people to be able to use the tools that they want. We want the people's tools that they like to just work. So instead of having to live in a world where you're like learning a new dataframe API and it's just slightly different, and if people love pandas, which we know they do based on just so much adoption and downloads, and we want pandas to just work for you, and we want it to work on 10 gigabytes or 10 terabytes. And in particular, we're targeting this problem of people have to rewrite. So they might prototype something in pandas and then rewrite it into a big data language. They might have to rewrite into Spark, and that could take many, many months. And then if there's an error, like you have these weird feedback loops of like trying to figure out who caused the error. And we want to be able to like write your code and it works as a prototype, and then you scale it in production, and that's it. So what that means is what we're doing is trying to get we're getting pandas to run, and our demos are the most boring demos ever for most of it, because it just looks like pandas. You just like dot head, whoop, same 5 rows every time. So there's order, and it's got like metadata stuff and whatever. And you go through, and the goal is to have it be super boring until you look down and you're like, whoa, that's on like billions of rows. Like that's a lot for pandas. So I think dbt my take is it like the stuff it's doing on documentation and on testing and on, we think like all of those things will interact with the Ponder world. This is more my take, I guess, than the company take, but kind of what we're thinking is, look, you use pandas, we want it to just work for you at whatever scale. So people who are more clever than I am or thought more about it might be able to see like exactly how all of those things come together. But yeah, are there any other Ponder people who want to chime in? Like, yep.
Yep. +1 to what you said, what Peter said. It's just like many of the customers that we talk to, many of their data science teams, they're coming from like their school, they use pandas, during the schools. So they come and they start working. They just love continue working with pandas, and they want the scalability. So many of these people that when we talk to them, they have challenges like managing clusters in Spark, dealing and learning the new technologies. So just continuing doing a scalability with pandas is a great experience for them.
And I'll say again that I think dbt, like so much of what dbt is adding to the conversation, dbt doesn't do the execution. Like my take is it's that opinionated philosophy and a set of tools that help you keep everything clean. Like even in a world where you're using Ponder and you're writing pandas like code, that doesn't say very much about the next level up, which is like, how should all of these things interact and how are these pipelines built? And so I don't see a ton of tension there. I guess Cody can talk more about the experience of using pandas with dbt right now. My suspicion is that there's quite a few people who, like he said, are frustrated because, APIs are different and they do 2 pandas and they might not realize exactly what's going on. That gets put in their memory and then it doesn't fit in memory. And so even dbt as it is, I think is probably experiencing the same kind of, it's seeing users with the same pain point of scaling pandas is tricky.
Definitely. I would say like, yeah, dbt does not scale your data or do anything technology wise. That's kind of all the backend platform. dbt tries to scale your process and your ops. And we are seeing a lot of people, I don't know exactly how familiar they are with Python before, but we are seeing a lot of issues where, yeah, they're hitting either out of memory issues or just expecting a different API than they're using, things like that. So a magical pandas that magically scales with the same API definitely sounds cool to me. And I think dbt users as well.
Mahesh raised his hand, and we'll maybe make this the last comment, and then I'll just say a quick thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say like a quick summary is that you can think of the Ponder product as being more like analogous to the role that Snowpark or the Pandas on BigQuery API plays right now. So, but we have our take is that we're trying to be really precise in replicating Pandas API and semantics.
Yes, I'm sure people on our team wish there are a lot of moments where they probably wish we didn't have to be quite so precise, because there's a lot of quirks about the Pandas API, but we love Pandas API. It's like the quirks of your uncle or your, younger sibling or something. Okay, Well, thank you so much, Cody, for coming today. This was awesome. And thank you everyone for attending. We'll have our next meetup on February 23rd. But yeah, thank you so much. This is super helpful for me.
Thank you.